Hello and welcome everyone. It's Suzanne here from the Project Manager Clinic, and today we've got a great conversation with an expert, and today's expert is Margaret Gilbert, and we're going to be talking about project conflicts or conflicts on projects. They are there all the time. They can be incredibly destructive, and the project manager really has to deal with that conflict in one way or another. And we're today going to give you some ideas of how to do that, and also a little bit of a few examples from myself and from Margaret. And don't forget to subscribe down below when this is on YouTube, and give us a thumbs up. And for anybody that's actually joining us on the session, this is recorded, as I just mentioned. So, Margaret, how have you been today?
Not bad, a bit chilly out there, but it's, you rug up a bit, it's okay. You can live with it. So,
You can live with it. Now, we were talking a little bit before about project conflict, and
mm.
there's a lot of different types of conflict. It's not just the same little bit of conflict that creeps in, is it?
No, and sometimes the source of the conflict is actually a bit of a surprise. One project that I worked on, the two execs that were in charge of different parts of the business that the project was across both of them, they were having their own issues, and the project just became a bit of the battleground where they would, try to make the other part look bad, which disrupted the team. And once we realized that as a team, then we stopped being, quite so receptive to their input. But nobody knew that was the problem. They couldn't figure out why different parts of the team were on different perspectives or different points of view. How did we not get all on the same page? And again, part of it is the currents outside the project was what was happening. It had nothing to do with the project. So once we kind of stopped paying attention to some of that stuff and just stayed focused on looking inward as to what the team was delivering, a lot of those problems kind of went away. They went around the team to somebody else, let somebody else worry about it. And we didn't get pulled into it. But again, I never knew that those were things I had to worry about, some of the political stuff happening outside the project or the program.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that people don't sometimes realize that projects are often stood up in maybe a chaotic environment. And certainly in probably the early 2000s and late 90s, there was all this rhetoric about the project is the catalyst for change. And what that really meant was the project manager is going to have to walk through fire, dragging people behind them. Incredibly unfair. But what you're sort of alluding to, I think, is we don't always know what's going on the periphery, do
Exactly.
we?
Especially if you come in as a contractor and you haven't been with the company for 10 years or 5 years, you don't know the personalities, you don't know
Yeah,
the currents, you don't know, where the sensitivities are, where the pain points are,
yeah,
because you're focused on the project or the program that you're trying to deliver. So you
yeah,
just don't know. And until you look around, you won't really figure it out. But again, as the project manager, you have to identify what matters to the project inside the circle as opposed or inside the tent as opposed to outside the tent, and
mm,
focus on what you can do about that, what's inside the tent. And when in doubt, just escalate it. If it's not something that's coming from within your team, then there's absolutely no problem with taking it to the program manager or the program sponsor and
yeah,
saying, I need a decision. I need someone to, pick A or B so we know which one we need to do. And not let it go on, not let it drag on. You
that's
need to let it
important.
happen. Sorry, you need to
Yeah,
let it happen so
mm,
that you can figure out what's happening, you and the team. But
yeah,
once you're aware of what the dynamics are, if the team can't resolve it because it's above their pay grade or it's so far out of scope for what the program needs to deal with,
yeah,
that's when you need to escalate it. So don't hesitate, escalate. You don't have to fix everything.
yeah, and that is a thing that sometimes project managers think they have to take everything on their shoulders, and they actually don't. That if we use our tools and our techniques, um, we can usually manage through things. And as you're saying, escalate if you're at all in doubt, or reach out and get support and get help.
Yep.
We don't have to be completely alone in all of this. So, project conflict can be a recipe for disaster. And certainly that example that you just gave, it sounds pretty nasty. How did you resolve that in the end?
So there were two things that I did. The first is when we had conflicts within the team, I kind of laid out the roadmap of how I think conflict should be resolved. And it was the usual things where you clarify your position, you acknowledge, you listen to the other person, you say back the things that they said to confirm that you understand. I found that by setting up an example where it was okay to disagree, that it wasn't a matter of life or death. And somebody explained to me once that when you're disagreeing with somebody, some people feel like they're on a level playing field. And if you and I are having an argument, Suzanne, if I knock you down, you're only going to fall to the ground. Or if you
Yeah,
knock me down, I'm only going to fall to the ground. But some people in a conflict or disagreement feel like they're at the edge of a 10,000-foot cliff. And
right.
if they lose, if they fall down, they're going to die. And so they have a much higher investment, emotional intensity to what they do because they feel less secure. Whereas if they're everybody's on level ground, it's just a disagreement. So part of that is I found is modeling the behavior of how you act in a conflict, where I tend to use um, active listening, or listening to what they say, acknowledging, calling out the differences between, acknowledging what they said, calling out the differences in our perspective, finding some place where we agree and take it from there. That we're not focusing on solving the whole world, just the piece that we
Yeah,
the only the difference of opinion. And I treat it as a difference of opinion. It's not a matter of life or death. It's not a win or lose competition. I give a little, they give a little, I propose something, they propose something, and we work it through. When people see that in a project, that it's okay to disagree and it's okay to change your mind and it's okay to say, well, I don't agree with you, but let's try it your way and see how it goes. And if it doesn't
yeah,
work, then we can try it my way. That path forward of a bit of give and take, because we all know that the answer is somewhere in the middle. The world is, unfortunately, projects are never black and white, they're always shades
mm,
of gray.
yeah,
And so by modeling that behavior as the project manager or program manager, people feel more comfortable saying, but wait, I'm not sure I agree with that. What if we did it this way? And if they see me, giving a little and me asking a little and working it through, then they're more comfortable when someone disagrees with them or when they want to disagree, because they know it's okay. It's kind of a safe place to say, I'm sorry, but I don't agree with that, as
yeah,
opposed to being on the edge of the 10,000-foot cliff. And if you concede anything, you're going to die, you're going to fall to your death.
yeah, yeah,
It takes a lot of that emotion and that stress out of it. And I don't mind conceding things. And to be honest, sometimes I had put forward really crappy ideas so people can tear them apart. And then I can say, well, you're right and I'm wrong.
yeah,
But again, it makes it a safe place to disagree. It makes it a safe place to have a difference of opinion. You can reach compromises. Now, the compromise isn't for anything ethical. It's not for how we spend money. It's not for, breaking,
true.
we're not going to break the law just so that the team can, come to a consensus on how to move forward. So that's non-negotiable. But a lot of the things that people disagree over aren't aren't essential to the quality of human life. They are, some of them are important and they need to
Yeah,
be worked through. But again, it's not a black and white. It's not a you win, I lose, or vice versa position. It's a matter of finding that common ground. And by modeling that behavior and showing them how I'm willing to give a little and I get a little in return, and and then we end up friends and we laugh and afterwards and go for a coffee, then it's fine. It takes a lot of the pressure off of people. They feel more comfortable disagreeing and not taking it personally.
and that's really important that people don't take things personally. Um, I had to do just another example, sort of similar to yours, I guess. I was called in a couple of years ago to work with two teams, two team leaders, who were, they weren't projects, they were actually business as usual doing, I won't say what they were doing, but two teams. They had
Mhm.
three or four people on each team. One was a male, one was a female, and they really didn't like each other. And HR, everybody had tried all this stuff to get these people to come to an agreement or at least be civil. They couldn't even be in the same room together, actually. That's how bad it was. So you can imagine
Pretty
how the
bad.
rest of the teams were. Um, so I was called in to really not read them the riot act, but to sit them down and tell them basically this is how adults behave. Like
Mm-mm.
it was to that point where one of them threw their chair across from pushed themselves back from the boardroom a table and I just said to them, well, I mean, if you think that's going to frighten me, it's not, because I've got a 15-year-old. Like I can understand this behaviour, but that behaviour shouldn't happen here. But what happened with all of that, and I think you alluded to this as well, is that conflict filtered down into the two teams.
Mm-hmm.
And people started to be frightened to speak up. And then lack of performance issues, people became incredibly unmotivated and the work was not getting done. And the easy solution to it would have been to sack one of them.
Or both of
But
them. Anyway, sorry.
or both of them, right? But actually, we managed to work through, and they both established a good working relationship. Did they really like each other? Don't know. And as I said to them, don't care.
Yeah.
But these are the sort of things, and you've alluded to that, that where individuals can cause almost harm to others, to the
Mm.
environment, and certainly to the deliverables.
Yep.
Now, we talked a little bit about the different types of where conflict comes from, but it can be vendors. It doesn't even have to be within your team, does it?
No, and it can be support personnel. It can be, you know,
Yeah,
especially if you're dealing with a couple of different vendors. I do quite a few programs and projects where the people on the team come from different vendors, and
yeah,
sometimes they're collaborative vendors, and sometimes they're not. And you almost get they're trying to make the other vendor look bad so they get more business going forward. And I have had a meeting with the two account managers for the two different vendors, and we had a come what I would refer to in America as a come to Jesus moment, where I just
yeah,
made it very clear that if they didn't sort their teams out, that they were both that they were going, and I'd find, you know, we'd get different vendors in and we'd get it done. And one of them, God love him, thought I was kidding, and he went to the program sponsor to complain because I, you know, read him the riot act. But I'd already spoken to the sponsor, and the sponsor had already agreed with me, so that pretty much sorted that one out, put that one to bed pretty quickly. But I found too that when you have contractors, you have permanent staff, you have people from different vendors, and sometimes they're you know, vendors for different parts of the business, and sometimes are different services, and sometimes they're vendors for the same services.
yeah,
It's sometimes good. I ignore all of that. I don't care who they work for. I don't care if they, you know,
yeah,
they're on a salary or a contract. I
yeah,
don't care. I don't care if
yeah,
they're working for free. I don't care. But what I do find sometimes is with those teams that come from a lot of different commercial arrangements, that it's sometimes good to have something else for them to focus on other than the program. And I'll use an example. There was one project I was doing for a very large bank. We had a couple of vendors involved, and the FIFA World Cup was coming. And so, you know,
right,
we internally to the team, like 10 minutes of our weekly meeting was to talk about, you know, who was going to support which teams and what we thought was going to happen with the FIFA World Cup. And at our daily stand-ups, we talked about, you know, how it went overnight, because that's where all the games were.
yeah,
And sometimes distracting the team, that 10 minutes every day at the stand-up, kind of got them, you know, changing sides, or, you know,
yeah,
being in alliance with other people. And it was the FIFA World Cup. So it wasn't like, you know, it had a direct impact on the program we were working on, but it helped them get to know each other a little bit differently by talking about the games and talking about something else that they could. And we had one of the dashboards, or one of the, you know, the things up on the wall, and it kept track of who was where, they, you know, in the playoffs, you know, each of the, you know, different parts of the game. It gave them something else to bond over, so it became less important. You know, it didn't matter. You could still support the Socceroos. It didn't matter whether you were a contractor or a perm, or what country you were born in, or, you know, what team you normally, you know, barracked for professionally. It just gave them a bit of a distraction to form a relationship outside of the who pays your
yeah,
bills or who pays your
yeah,
salary.
yeah. It's that bonding experience, which we often have forming on projects anyway,
Mm,
particularly when we might be isolated, we're off site, we're out of the norm. Um, People do tend to bond in different ways. Now, we discussed a little bit about where conflict comes from, Margaret, and you
mm,
pointed out a couple of interesting areas where it comes from.
One of the things I find interesting, especially working in IT projects, is that neurodiverse people interact differently than neuronormative people do.
Yeah,
And sometimes if you work with somebody who's very direct and they you don't couch it, if they think it, they say
yeah,
it and it comes out directly. Sometimes people feel like they're being put on the spot. They think the person's doing it on purpose and person genuinely doesn't know. So sometimes
yeah,
I find, again, how I interact with that person, and if they can talk to me that way and I take it in stride, people tend to be a little less sensitive to it, but it can be confronting. I'm not trying to diminish it,
yeah,
but by the fact that people speak and interact differently, they're not intending it to be the way you're taking it. Sometimes that's just good to know that. And I mentioned to you before that I've worked in countries where, um, culturally, there are certain ways you do things, and you don't want to take the chance of your words being misconstrued if you're trying to achieve something, because culturally you're very aggressive and very dominant. And not everybody is comfortable with that. It's can be very confronting if you're used to a much more engaging and egalitarian way of communicating.
yeah,
But again, by modeling the behavior from the top where I accept that, I asked them if they could tone it down a little bit, and they apologized because they didn't realize they were coming across as so aggressive. It kind of takes that level of personality out of it, because they see that it's okay, and the person is comfortable talking because you called out that you were uncomfortable. They then change their behavior.
yeah,
And again, culturally, you take it, you get used to it, and people learn to interact more effectively. But they have to feel like they're in a bit of a safe place. And then there's, you're always going to have a team where there's one person who does it just for fun. They like to poke a bit of fun, or they like to,
yeah,
purposely cause antagonism, and part of it is to deflect the pressure off of them because they don't feel comfortable. They don't want to get caught out as being the person who doesn't know something, so they turn it on somebody else. But again, how you as the project manager respond and handle that, sometimes you just have to just say, look, there's people who feel a bit sensitive when this happens, so can we all just be aware and maybe not do that? Or when you
yeah,
realize you're doing it, take a breath and step back so that you aren't doing it. But again, modeling the acceptable behaviors at the top of the team can be really effective at diffusing a lot of that, and it doesn't necessarily foster or fester behind the scenes if you just call it out.
yeah, if you call it out. Um, and very often there are places within the organisation that you can go that you can get some support, like HR or
Yeah.
industrial relations or whoever it
Yeah.
is, or your sponsor or whoever it is.
And I
I,
also
I
just want, but sorry, while
yeah,
you said that, I just want to call out too that there are times where behavior is unacceptable. If it's bullying or intimidation
yes,
or misogyny or racism or homophobia or Islamophobia or any other phobia you got,
yeah,
that's non-negotiable. And when that behavior happens, it goes straight to HR. There's
exactly.
no gray area. There's no second chance when they cross
Mm,
that line, because
mm,
every company I've ever worked at, whether I'm a contractor or an employee, has policies about acceptable behavior in the workplace. And
yeah,
I don't care if they're in the team, I don't care if they're on the steering committee, I don't care if they're an executive. That kind of behavior, you have to call it out. You can't let it go through, because it'll destroy all the things you've built up.
yeah,
Will get smashed, and no one's going to feel comfortable because they don't want to be yelled at, or have racial slurs or religious slurs or
yeah,
whatever. And again, so that, to me, for me, that's one of those that, that's a red line we're not going to cross. And if you cross it,
mm,
we're going to HR, and we're going to
yeah,
HR now. We're not going to wait to the end of the meeting so you can keep on doing it. Well, and
yeah,
again, if they know that that's what's going to happen, people tend to moderate their behavior. And even the people who do it recreationally to stir the pot just to see what happens, they tend not to stir it if they know that they're going to end up at HR,
yeah,
and then
yeah.
you're going to have to deal with HR.
Yeah, look, I've had people who have misbehaved and they've been in a key role in the project. Um, I worked overseas once on a big project as the program director and my enterprise architect, and there was a number of cultural issues as well, as well as gender issues because I'm a female in this other country. Um, as the head of the program. and this person didn't want to play, and was warned and had in-depth discussions with me, robust ones, I must say. And at the end, and kept saying, you can't get rid of me because I'm, I'm imperative to the program and blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, I said, well, you have to go. You'll go, like you're out.
Yep,
And
yep.
they were absolutely stunned. But
Mm.
what happened on the program then was that everybody, it was almost like a collective sigh of relief.
Yes, right.
Everyone, oh,
Yeah, finally it's over.
yeah, yeah, because this person was very autocratic and throwing weight around where they shouldn't, well, it was none of their business
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
doing it. So everyone else was quiet. And it's very difficult on a project when you're trying to move things forward very quickly. And the other thing I often say to people is, I'd love to give you three chances, but I'm not going to
No,
because I don't have that much time. I'm just going to cough, excuse me.
yeah, that's fine.
So we've talked about a couple of ways that or where conflict can come from, but how does it show up? What sort of behaviours do we see, or are there behaviours that we can look for, Margaret, that
So there's a couple of
flag?
things that I've noticed. One is that the conflict kind of becomes a bit passive aggressive. And so the same questions get asked over and over and over again, like a constant distraction, questioning the value of something, or, was something really good enough? Did it really get signed off? And that's one of the things, is the bit of background noise, and
Yes,
people aren't sure, do I
the
trust it
chatter.
because has it really been signed off? The
Yeah,
second thing that I found is that, um, to get somebody, again, the passive aggressive, they don't want to give you a date that it's going to be done. They keep coming up with 20 reasons
yeah,
why it's going to be late, but they still can't tell me two things that are important: what's being done to get the problem out of the way, and when is it going to be fixed by. And so that again is one of my red flags, that there's something going on there. And it could be that somebody's not comfortable to say, I'm not getting what I need. So, I can't commit. But sometimes it's, you didn't give me what I wanted over here. So now I'm going to ruin what you want over here. And so it's
yeah,
that passive aggressive, they're
true.
not coming and telling you to piss off, but they're just never going to
Yeah,
finish whatever that they need to do. And that, so those are two of the things that I look for, because most people, when they work collaboratively and it's in a positive, productive way, I have noticed that they tend to go faster. They share ideas off of each other or bounce
yeah,
ideas off of each other. They're excited about getting it done. And when those things aren't there, then I know that there's something going on. And sometimes it's you know the obvious things, when the account manager for that part of the team, that vendor or whoever you're talking to, keep wanting to talk to you about the contract and the terms of the contract. That's how I know there's, there's something wrong. I don't
yeah,
always know what it is, and sometimes it comes from outside the project, to be honest. But as soon as someone wants to sit down and go through the contract with me, I know that we're in trouble, because there's not a lot of room once you start looking at the contract, to get things fixed. Um, so again, those are the kinds of things I look for. But again, you can tell from the energy of your team, and different teams, different parts of the team. Sometimes part of the team is having a problem and others aren't, and you can tell by the lack of energy, the lack of excitement. And if they're not laughing and chattering, and they aren't, somebody goes to get coffee and brings back coffee for everybody else, those are the kinds of signs you can look for to say that the team is actually functioning pretty well. They're pretty comfortable with each other. But
yeah,
when they all go to coffee at different coffee shops, and none of them want to come back because they don't want to be back at their desk, because they don't want to have to deal with something,
yeah,
that lack of energy, or that lethargy, the bland, if they're not laughing and
yeah,
mucking around, then they're not having a good time, and you need to find out what it is. And again, sometimes those conflicts aren't in your face making misogynistic statements because you're a woman. Sometimes they're passive aggressive,
yeah.
behind the scenes, little, snide comments, or
Mm,
snarky emails, or whatever.
Mm.
You just have to trust your gut. Sometimes you know something's wrong. And I have had meetings with my team where I've said, look, there's something going on and you guys aren't having a good time. I don't know what it is. If you don't want to tell me here, then let me know after the meeting. But we need to get it out in the open so we can do something about it.
Yeah.
And when three or four people start talking at the same time, then I know I asked the right question.
Right.
Um, but when it's dead silent and nobody looks at each other and they're all, checking their phones or their laptops or looking out the window, then I know that, it's a big one.
Yeah.
And that's when I usually leverage the one-on-ones I've been having with the team. So even the people who don't directly report to me, I do meet with them regularly over coffee or, just a chat someplace and over lunch or whatever. It's not, it doesn't have to be anything formal, but that's when you leverage those relationships, because the relationships, again, people need to feel comfortable to come to you and say, look, everybody else thinks it's fine, but I don't. Here's why. They need to feel
Yeah.
like that's a safe place. And if you've modeled the behavior where you deal with that positively and constructively, and it's okay to
Yeah.
say, look, I'm not comfortable. The other thing I've noticed too is sometimes when people on the team feel like they aren't being set up for success, they've been given something to do, but they're not given the resources they need, or
Yeah.
they're told to do something, but they don't have the tools, or the tools are not working as expected, and they don't know what to do about it. Sometimes, again, that's where you get that flat energy,
Yeah.
and then you can talk to somebody and just ask the question. What is it you need? What can I do to get these obstacles out of your way so you can deliver? And sometimes positioning it like that helps them find out what they're conflicted about. And again, if they're not comfortable, sometimes it's not having a fight with someone else. Sometimes it's just doubting themselves, and they just don't feel comfortable going ahead because they feel like they're going to fail and everybody's going to laugh at them. So it's
Look,
that internal
yeah,
conflict.
we talked a bit about that in one of our Ask a Mentor sessions, where this person was a solo project manager and they didn't feel that they were really a project manager and they questioned themselves. So that's not so good, I guess, either. Um, there are times, though, where people are very slow to come forward or perform because somebody else in the room is not actively preventing them from speaking, but there's a fear, and it's not like open warfare or
Oh,
conflict like that. But I've heard, and only fairly recently, I've heard senior managers, execs, in team meetings abusing staff, abusing people on projects, abusing their staff. Now that is almost open warfare, and it's completely and utterly unacceptable. But
mhm.
when it is like the CIO or the CFO or somebody quite senior, it's very difficult for people to deal with that level of conflict.
Yep. And that's the toxic workplace. That's the
Yeah,
toxic environment. And as a project manager, there's not always a lot you can do about that. Again, sometimes you need to go to the program sponsor, or somebody at the C-suite level that isn't as toxic as those people are, to try to
yeah,
get something done about it. I've also found that going to HR, sometimes they can give you some coping mechanisms you can share with the team, but then they do a bit of their job behind the scenes as well,
yeah,
because their job in HR is not to make the execs look good. Their job in HR is to keep the company from being sued. So
yeah,
sometimes raising it with HR, and I've had people in those toxic workplace environments where somebody, you hate to go to a meeting with somebody because they're just so unpleasant and
yeah,
inappropriate.
yeah,
I invite HR to those meetings. But then when by raising it with HR, sometimes they can come to your team and go over the policies and give you the team some coping ideas to
yeah,
how to cope with those things, which doesn't come out and say, because the CFO is an idiot, that would, because that would be so wrong, accurate,
yeah,
but still wrong. But
yeah,
again, getting HR involved to help support your team to get them through those difficult situations, or those difficult meetings with people who
yeah.
violate the company policies, but they're high enough up that you're not really going to do much about it.
No,
But to get HR involved and the program sponsor, make them aware of it, that helps to kind of protect your team a bit, but it gives them the coping mechanisms they need so that they're a bit clearer on when it happens. They're not caught totally by surprise. that they have some things and they can help each other because they
Yeah.
all know they're all going through it.
Yeah, look, it's a very difficult situation. I mean, for me, I would probably and have done just say that's just not appropriate. We'll talk afterwards. I'm able to do
No, no,
that.
I've done the same thing, but then I've also had them double down, and that's the
Yeah,
part
of
I
course.
tried to
Yeah,
avoid.
exactly.
But again,
Yeah.
it depends on how bad it is, and if it's something they
Mm.
do all the time, you can find ways to cope with it. But with the first time it happens, it catches you by surprise.
It's a
You
shock.
aren't prepared for
That's
someone to
right.
do that.
It's a shock. And I've had people come to me just completely, they've come out of the meeting. I haven't been in the meeting and
Mm,
completely like they've been belted around the head. They're completely shocked. And then the next thing is they feel guilt that they didn't speak up. It's
yep.
very difficult. Very,
But then
very difficult.
I've been the person who spoke up, and again, the perpetrator doubled down on me,
Yeah,
and that and then no one else is going to come to my defense because they know that they're just going to get splattered with the same stuff. So it's a really difficult situation, but you can deal with it behind the scenes. Like, you can go around the problem and
mm,
escalate it in other ways so that hopefully if it happens it's not as bad next time. But again, the team having coping mechanisms to understand how they can deal with it helps them, when because
yeah.
those people don't tend to stop their behaviors. They're going to keep doing that. They've been getting away with
Oh,
it for years. So why would they
exactly.
change now?
Exactly, exactly. And I think this is a really important point, what you're talking about now, because people tend to blame themselves
Yeah.
when it's not really their fault. Um, and their response might make it worse if it's the wrong response. But those coping mechanisms so that they know what's acceptable, what's okay for them, what's acceptable in the company is very important. As a project manager, it's probably our role to facilitate that sort of
Yes.
discussion, even with if that is with HR, whoever it's with, but to facilitate it. And we can get quite protective about our team. I know that I'm often standing there
Yes.
going, stay away from
Yes.
them, leave them alone,
Yep.
let them work.
Yep.
I
Let
don't
them do
want
their
any
job.
more interruptions, thanks. Um,
Yep.
Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things in our project manager toolset that we can use to diffuse open conflict really quickly. And then not necessarily that meeting that I was talking about,
Yep.
but you can quite often get into meetings where people are, they're very animated, let's say.
Hmm.
Maybe there's not conflict, it could get to conflict. There may be somebody in the room that is a stakeholder that's not at all happy with what's going on.
Hmm.
Everybody else, and this has been my experience lots of times, everybody then starts to justify why
Yep.
it's okay. And that just escalates things with the stakeholder because, of course, they're not being listened to.
Yep. And they feel as if they're being discounted or they're being dismissed.
Yeah,
And one of the things we did talk about before was, if these things do come up, an effective way to capture them and to give you a mechanism to deal with them, a tangible way of dealing with them, is by using your issues register. And if you log
yes,
it as an issue and you define what the issue is, then it the person feels heard, which is a good always a good thing. But it also means that it goes through the same process that the other issues go through. And so it's not just a set and forget. It actually has to do more with, we'll deal with that issue like we deal with all the other issues, and it goes through the normal escalation channels, and it gets
yeah,
reported at steerco. And sometimes we've kicked off special working groups because we've had two or three issues that were all very similar. So instead of dealing with them separately, we just put together a working group and they deal with them collectively. And again, sometimes that diffuses the tension because person feels listened to. They know that something's being done about it and they can participate in that
yeah.
process to make sure that it actually gets fixed. It's not just we logged it, we made it amber, tick, we're done, we move on to something else.
I think issues management is very underrated and
Mhm.
it can be very powerful and it's very good in even the everyday where I've used it. I have not even said I'm using my issues management. I just will say things like, I've heard what you've said. I think that this is what the issue is that you've talked about. Is that what it is? Can I understand it? And already we're starting to bring the temperature down. And particularly in those sorts of meetings where there's a stakeholder, and they're often a business stakeholder in a room of IT people or
Yep.
agile people who are very keen on what they're doing and very knowledgeable, um, they're not being heard. So that way of what you're saying, um, validate, verify that you understand it, and put it as an agenda item or an issues, on the issues register. So it's going to get dealt with. It really does bring the tension down. Now, another example that we had was dealing with frustration and anger. This can happen um, where there's a lot of frustration and anger in the room. And I've sort of suggested there's a couple of ways around that too. That's again, the asking questions. But it's like there's no point talking to a child that's stamping their feet, having a tantrum. You got to wait till the tantrum's over
Yep.
until you can approach the person um, who's angry. But as you alluded to earlier, if it's a dangerous situation, then something needs to be done at the time.
Yes.
And hopefully you will have set up your project environment so that people know what behaviour is acceptable and when to go and get help if it's you that's being yelled at and you
No,
can't leave.
but the other thing to remember too is that, you know, understanding what's acceptable is one thing, but when you don't feel safe, if you don't
Yeah,
feel, that it's going to ruin your career or you're going to lose your job, um, people need to understand that it's okay and that they've seen how these things can get resolved. They need to understand that there are pathways, and if they're not comfortable or they're not feeling safe, that
yeah,
they can do something about it. They just need to feel like they've got that option, and that's,
yeah,
again, part of that's the workplace. That most places have policies and procedures in
mm,
the HR space, and a lot even have conflict resolution, so that if there is a
of
conflict,
course. Yeah,
and some of the conflicts are because of power imbalance, because one person has a lot more clout or is seen as being a more powerful or important than the other one. But some of it, again, is if you don't feel comfortable putting your hand up, you wait too late, and then you're in a panic. And
yeah,
if you felt safer doing it sooner. So again, a lot of it is the timing matters as well. But you have to make sure too that everybody's clear on what they're responsible for. I've worked on teams or worked with teams where there's a lot of gray areas about what they're supposed to be doing and what their contribution is. And it's we talked about the RACI earlier,
yeah,
or a previous part of our conversation
yeah,
before the call. And sometimes reviewing those RACIs and making sure people understand what they're responsible for and what they're not responsible for takes the
mm,
pressure off them a bit. They don't feel like they've got to fix all the problems or solve everything all in one go. And it lets them focus on different things that they need to be focusing on instead of trying to focus on everything. So
yeah,
again, those are project management things we have in our toolkit that we can use to help with these conflicts, because the clarity of who's accountable, who's responsible, who's consulted, who's informed, making that clear, sometimes that stills some of the noise, or turns down some of the noise. Because if you're consulted or informed, you're not the decision maker, you're not responsible. So, you know, nicely, she
thank you.
says, sit down and shut up. um,
Exactly. Yeah,
but again, those are project management tools that help. They give you a mechanism, even in a difficult situation. It gives you a mechanism that everybody's familiar with. They've seen them before, that you can then use specifically to address the conflict or the anger or the frustration that somebody
yeah,
has.
exactly. Now we've got probably another 5 or so minutes to go. Just for people watching, click subscribe, give us a thumbs up down below. We love doing this and like to bring you lots more of these. Now, Margaret, there were some things around active listening that might be good to explore a little bit more in the remaining time, turning conflict into
Yep.
opportunity. If you could expand that a little bit more, because these are sort of our management skills,
Yes.
aren't they?
Yeah, so active listening, one of the things, the first thing with active listening is to make sure that we're clear on what we're talking about. Sometimes people are talking at cross purposes, and
Mm,
that's what's
yeah,
causing the conflict. But making sure that the people sit down and we talk about um, what the problem is. We describe where the disagreement is, or what does it look like, or draw me a picture or something tangible to
yeah,
help anchor it. Just helps to diffuse some of the emotion as well. But having said that, I also find it's a good idea while you're focusing the conversation on what the conflict is about, you need to make sure that you're paying attention to people's body language. And if somebody says, yes, I'm fine with that, but their leg is shaking, or they're, drumming the table with their fingers,
yeah.
or they're not making eye contact, or they just seem distressed, then there's something else going on there, and you can't let that go. You need to help them to make sure that they're actually getting out what it is that they want to say. They're not just agreeing because the person they're scared of said something, or the person they're uncomfortable with said something, and they just want it to be over with.
Mm,
You also encouraging them to tell you what they're feeling or what they're thinking. And sometimes they're the same, the feeling and thinking are two sides of the same coin, but getting them to actually say it out loud um, helps them sometimes, and it also helps the other person because they get a better idea of
right.
what's really going on behind the facade or behind the macho, power play
Oh,
kind of
okay.
stuff.
That's interesting. Yeah,
And so by encouraging them, and then you hear what they say, and you as the independent party, you say it back to them,
right.
and paraphrase it in your own language, to validate and anchor it back to something that everybody's agreed to. It makes the gap seem smaller, that the mountain you're trying to climb maybe isn't a mountain, maybe it's just a big hill. So it helps to anchor it, and it helps to diffuse some of the tension by being validating, but also returning a bit of perspective to it. And then I find it's good to ask clarifying questions, to understand what it is, what's behind what they're asking, or what's the next level of detail that we haven't gotten to yet. You can't get everything out of them, but by asking the questions and giving them a chance to answer them, and then saying it back to them, validating what they've said and saying it back to
Yeah,
them. Again, going back to the anchor points where we've agreed, these are the things we've agreed to, which is just a little bit different than what we've agreed to, kind of takes some of the tension out of it. The hardest thing for me to do is to not, you know, make the umpire's call and just say, right, so let's do this. My job is not to fix it. I want to fix it. I'm an engineer. Fixing things is what I
yeah,
do, but it's not to make the judgment or not to make the call, but to lead them on the path so that they get close enough so that then I can bring them together for that last step. And again, it's not forever. It's to what do we do next for the next week, or what do we do for the next couple of days, see how it goes, and then we make adjustments from there, so that they can
mm,
see, they feel they've been heard, that their opinions or their concerns have been validated, acknowledged by the other person. So the other person
yeah,
knows they're not just being a pain in the bum, that there are genuine things that they're concerned about that maybe they
mm,
hadn't considered.
yeah,
And then we do have a path forward, but we're going to touch base and, like, give it a couple of days, and then we'll get together and see where we're going. And maybe we can tweak it a bit. Or if it's not working, we'll stop and do something else. And if it is working, let's keep the parts that are working and change something that's not. And again, taking them on that journey so that at the end of it, they own the solution. It's not you. It's not my job to fix everything. I'd like to fix everything, but I can't fix everything.
that's interesting what you're saying because it's not just one meeting. You're following that through to continue working it out
Mhm.
until it's done, basically.
Yep. And
Wow.
until done is when both parties are okay. They don't have to be happy.
Yeah,
I don't expect them to, hug or shake hands or, exchange home phone numbers or anything.
yeah,
But I do expect that we get closer to a common ground, and come up with a solution that's going to work. Because the other thing to remember about projects is that some of this stuff has to survive after the project has gone live. You
true.
you you, you have to go live. You got to, practice cutover, you do cutover, you do hypercare, and then you transition to BAU. You can't just put a band-aid on it and hope for the best. You need to come up with solutions that are going to be able to
Yeah,
survive the cutover, the hypercare, and the transition to
true.
BAU. And so
Right.
sometimes teams get very focused on what's right in front of them, and they forget that we need to look longer term. And again, that's another project management thing that we have to remember. It's not just build it and deliver it and we're done. That was good. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
We have to make sure that that whatever gets resolved can go on to hypercare and BAU.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to wrap up now, Margaret, but one more
Okay.
question that I've got for you. Given everything that we've just talked about, and it's been a really informative session, thank you so much. My question is, have we got it covered as project managers, or is there something else that, as a project manager, we need to develop as a skill set?
My opinion is you need to learn how to manage your project sponsor, and
Yeah,
the key members of the steering committee. Not every member of the steering committee, but you've got to manage out. You've got to let them know that these are issues that are coming up, um, whether they're conflicts or other kinds of issues. But you've got to let them know it's coming. You've got to give them a heads up that you're going to come to them and ask them to make a decision, and whatever decision they make is going to have to hold for the rest of the project into BAU. And you have to manage out, you've got to communicate out, and it
yeah.
can't be done. You can't surprise them. Well, you can surprise them in a steering committee meeting, but that can be a kind of a career limiting move. So you need to be
Yes,
proactive and make sure that they're aware of those things, because they can do things as well outside of the program to make some of the noise go away, or to
yeah,
put a bit of a buffer in between whatever it is and the team. And they can also sort out vendors, because they're the people who sign those vendor
true.
contracts, and
Mm,
they can get that stuff sorted out. So we need to, I think, as project managers and program managers, we need to be better about communicating out. As much as we focus on the what happens inside the tent, we need to
true.
communicate out to make
Mm,
sure that people know it's coming. So when you go to them and you say, I need this, you need to pick A, B, or C, they can just pick B and we move on.
yeah.
So
And look,
that would be my suggestion.
that's very, very valid point. And thank you again, Margaret. It's been great
A
talking to
pleasure.
you in understanding or having some examples of how we can deal with conflict on projects, on our projects, which can be disruptive and very damaging, actually,
Mm.
if it's not handled. So we've come away with some really good things. Again, for people who are watching, subscribe down below, give us a thumbs up, and thanks again, Margaret.
No worries. Thanks a lot, Suzanne.